everybody. Thank you for coming to what is actually the third of our events. This is a new series we've initiated this year to look at sort of current events on a less academic and more discursive basis. This is our third, focusing on communications policy in the new administration. Just to give you the advertisement up ahead, on April 6th, we'll have our fourth and final one for the year, also at 4:30. On, I think that Samsung versus Apple case, which is really a design patent case, and the look and feel, and can you protect the design aspects of Apple. And this has been a long-running battle that has paralyzed or has had a huge impact on the smartphone world. And we'll have that conversation as we go on. But today's topic is about communications policy in the next administration. We both have our crystal balls out here. I'm Christopher Yu. I teach here in the law school, and this is Kevin Werbach, who among his has been called like the most important technological lawyer of the FCC. I can't even remember the quote. He worked in the Federal Communications.
Sounds good, whatever it is. I don't remember either, but yeah.
He worked in the internal think tank in the FCC, which is then called the Office of Plans and Policy, now called the Office of Strategic Planning. No, they changed it again, haven't they? Anyway, Office of Strategic Planning and Policy. He is currently, has major conferences out on the West Coast under the tutelage of Esther Dyson and doing called Supernova. And he is currently a professor in legal studies. He was actually one of the leaders of the transition team for the Federal Communications Commission for the Obama administration. So he has seen transitions like this before, and he's very experienced and knows where he speaks. And so we have a series of topics which we have teed up as likely possibilities of areas for action, and we're just going to tick them off one at a time. So Kevin, why don't you start us off? The future of network neutrality, we've been talking about it for a decade. It's the obvious issue to start with. Yeah. What does the future hold for us?
Sure. So first of all, thanks, Christopher. Thanks, CTIC. Glad to be here. As I was saying before we came on, you probably picked one of the few areas where you and I suspect, will largely agree, which is predicting what will happen. We'll probably disagree more if we get into what we think should happen, but that's okay. So at a high level, it's kind of weird being in communications policy at the start of this administration, because it's one of the few areas where very little has changed. We're still fighting about the same things that we were fighting about before. Certainly, we've gone from a Democratic administration to a Republican administration, but on a lot of the issues, it's not clear that things would be any different if the Republican president who won the election had been John Kasich or Jeb Bush. And on a bunch of things, it's not clear the issues are all that different if it had been Hillary Clinton who was the president. Net neutrality is not one of them, but some of the others it might be. And that's, of course, very different from what we're seeing in a lot of other areas where we have people coming in who are totally out of the box or, to some of our minds, totally crazy. At the FCC, we've got a new chairman, Ajit Pai, who is a known quantity, is experienced, has been at the commission as a commissioner for 5 years, is smart and thoughtful and has a real agenda. And his agenda is generally within the Republican mainstream on these issues. So it's different than the kind of discussion we would be having if we were talking about, say, environmental policy in this administration or a lot of other areas. So with that said, net neutrality. I keep being surprised at the number of articles that I read that with some surprise say, Chairman Pai is going to try to kill net neutrality, or the new administration is opposed to the net neutrality rules that were put into place by the Obama administration. Well, duh. So, I mean, basically, even though we can go back and say that the genesis of net neutrality was somewhat bipartisan in that there were Republicans like Kevin Martin who did the first net neutrality complaint proceeding against Comcast, and there were a number of conservative groups, including some of the Christian groups, that were supportive originally of net neutrality. Basically, the last several years, it's divided very sharply along party lines. So it's not at all surprising that now that we have a Republican president, a Republican FCC chair, and a Republican Congress in both houses, that their goal, as it has been all along, is to scale back the FCC's net neutrality rules. What's interesting, though, to me, is how dramatically the center of gravity of the debate has shifted. So if you look at what in 2006 or even 2008, when the presidential election that led to President Obama was happening, what was considered a democratic net neutrality result, what would have been a result that would have been a positive result from the perspective of the pro-net neutrality forces. And then you look at what is the net neutrality result that's being kicked around by the current Republican leadership of Congress, and that most of the major industry players, companies like AT&T and Verizon and Comcast, have said that they consider an appropriate resolution to net neutrality. They're almost the same. What's happened is a very dramatic shift in what the discussion is and what the norms are of net neutrality. So what we ultimately got in 2015 was the FCC reclassifying broadband under Title II as a regulated common carrier that had a tremendous amount of opposition from both the Republicans and the industry groups. But if we look at, even if those forces are successful in overturning what the FCC did, and we can talk more about whether that's going to be the case, we're not going to go back to a world where there's no net neutrality rules. We're going to go to a world where there are some enforceable rules against blocking, some enforceable rules against discrimination, probably some enforceable rules about paid prioritization, and some role for the FCC or some other agency, at least to resolve complaints in an enforceable way. And so, again, I'll reserve for now whether I think that that's a good resolution. It's certainly not what we have today, but it's very different from saying either we're going to have net neutrality or we're not. So let me stop there, as I've said a lot, and see what you think.
So it's I think even more complicated. This is funny, even though I'm the person who's supposed to be trending towards a result that it's favoring. I actually think it's going to be more complicated than we think. So first is I remember when communications policy has traditionally not been terribly partisan. And I remember I wrote a paper right in 2007 where I did a legislative history, and you can see when it happened. The network neutrality provision passed, doesn't matter which way, through the Senate by wide measures. There was reform legislation in 2007. Passed the Senate uncontroversially. Got to the House, straight party line vote on a partisan position. I can't remember which way it went. But the bottom line is you could see in that time in 2007 between the two houses where it became a political issue. For different reasons, a lot of it was the Tea Party embraced opposition to network neutrality, which polarized it to the right, and there were a lot of very strange dynamics which took us in different directions. So we have this world now. Now the funny thing is, because this has been going on for basically going on a dozen plus years, and Pai and O'Reilly have been in the minority, they're going to have trouble finding the compromise solution that I think Kevin has correctly identified that they would like, but they've written so many dissents saying there is no legal basis for doing this under this way or that way. I actually don't know that they have a legal basis left. So they've either got to walk back from one of the positions they took. This is why you have to be careful when you write an opposition and dissents complaining, because if you actually end up in power, you're going to be constrained by what you wrote before. And so they took the dissenting positions like, I want to take a flamethrower to everything they say, and I think it's coming back to haunt them. Because they really don't have a base. The industry compromise in place is clearly in favor towards some median position. And this is why everyone's hoping to go to Congress. Because the way you sidestep all this, you get congressional resolution of this. I think all of us agree that's been the better answer. The history of this reminds me, when cable television came in the 50s, we tried to fit it. Is this broadcasting? Is this telephone? It was a broadcasting. It was an adjunct to broadcasting. Went to the Supreme Court up and down, yes, no, maybe, and finally in 1984, it's like, we need to write a statute just for cable, because it's different. It's video over wires instead of video over the air or telephone over wires. The internet's the same way. We need a new statute. And the statute they want is the Waxman bill. It's a Democratic proposal that was done before. Everyone was trying to decide, should we tweak a little bit? But if you start doing that, then the better thing is just get an up or down vote on something clean that no one touches, and that's the way they're going to do it. The chance of passing something through this Congress on telecom reform, in my opinion, is very low. There are many of my friends I agree it's the right answer. Many of my friends in DC optimistically think it's the right, that it's going to happen. It has to have 8 Democratic votes to vote for it. I can't count to 8. More importantly, there are so many issues the current Congress is having to deal with that are more critical than communications policy reform. I just don't see how it gets to the top of the agenda. So I actually see this is going to take a long time, because this was a rule upheld by the courts as legal. So you don't just throw out a rule and notice it up and move forward. It's going to probably take a year. And I don't think the commission itself knows which way it's going to go. One last thought. The politics around network neutrality have been exquisite. So in the 2010 order, the primary proponent out of the industry was Google. By 2015, Google was opposed to Title II reclassification. The primary proponent was Netflix. And if you want to see the influence of politics, of companies on politics, Netflix is a textbook example. Fairly small company, fairly new at the game, worked the PR, worked the press beautifully to have influence punching far above the weight that anyone could possibly imagine. Fascinatingly, Netflix now says we can live with without Title II. They're walking back from that position because they're realizing, one, politically, it's not going to hold. So what's the point of sticking with it? But more to the point, they think there's enough room in the rules. We'll see if they're just saying that because they have to or they really mean it. But it suggests that there's a lot more room for compromise. I actually think from a legal standpoint, there's a lot more political room for compromise. I actually think that O'Reilly and Pai have painted themselves into a corner, and they're going to have trouble.
Yeah, so most of that I agree with. You're right, the politics are complicated, and so what we're seeing now is this kind of strange two-step that's going on between the Republicans at the FCC and the Republicans in Congress, where they're each saying, you go first. No, you go first. No, you go first. And it gets even deeper than that in terms of different things within the House and different things within the Senate and who's up for re-election in the Senate in this cycle and so forth. There's broad agreement on what they think should happen. But for all the reasons that Christopher described, I'm not sure we're going to get there in terms of any dramatic move, but I think they have to do something because you're absolutely right. This is not, as things go, a top priority. Symbolically, it's a really big thing. It's a big thing for the Tea Party. It's a big thing it was a big victory. That was the signature victory for the Obama administration on tech policy. So therefore, unwinding that is a singularly important thing for the current Republican majority. So they're going to try. But I agree. I'm not sure exactly how they're going to get there. And part of it goes back to what I said, that Chairman Pai and Commissioner O'Reilly are not of the persuasion, which we have a lot of leadership now in the government that's of the persuasion of, let's just do it. Even though there's no colorable legal argument why we could just reverse it, they do try, let's just do it, and we'll win. They actually want to put something in place that's going to be upheld and that is legally viable. So yeah, all of that is challenging. The question, and I think Christopher was right, that it sort of gets to whether net neutrality gets addressed as a standalone issue, and even if there's not some new legislation in Congress, or even if the FCC doesn't put out an order that's reversing the Title II classification, there's lots of ways that the FCC can walk back. They already have canceled the zero rating inquiry and scaled back a number of the implementation initiatives on net neutrality. So they'll do as much of that as they possibly can. The question is, if we get into this debate where there is actually bipartisan consensus, imagine that we need a rewrite of the Communications Act. The 1996 Act, which we have now, was out of date in 1996, and it's way out of date now. That's something where there, I think, really is genuine enthusiasm from the Republican congressional leadership to do that, and there's a lot of support from the Democratic side as well, but it's going to take a very long time. And the one thing I will disagree with you on is communications policy hasn't always been partisan in the same way it is now, but it's always been partisan in certain ways. So I was at the FCC when the 96 Act passed. I was at the FCC when the 94 and 95 Act were being developed. Now, those never got passed. Those were the communications rewrite under the Democratic majority House before the Gingrich election of 1994. Very different bills. The FCC, the Clinton administration, Reed Hunt FCC, was very deeply involved working with Congress in drafting those bills. We were not asked to be very deeply involved in drafting the bill that eventually became the 96 Act under the new Republican Congress. So it has always made a difference, but what's changed, at least in the politics congressionally, is back then in '96, we had all of these rural state Democrats. So people like Ted Stevens, may he rest in peace, from Alaska, who were, excuse me?
He's a Republican.
What?
Ted Stevens.
Ted Stevens, no, it's not, you're right, not Ted, but there were a bunch of rural state Democrats. No, fair enough. But a bunch of rural state Democrats who were on the sort of conservative side of these issues, but were Democrats, and now they're pretty much all gone. And even the sort of Ted Stevens Republicans are being replaced by more Tea Party type Republicans. So therefore, the politics are much more dramatic on the Congress.
So it'll be interesting to see what happens with the rewrite.
Burns is who I'm thinking about.
Yeah, but
Conrad Burns. Okay, all right.
So this is one of the big questions. Is I think that what's fascinating is the politics of major rewrites. They normally take several years, and they have to be loaded up. And I think there is broad support. So right now, what you have is a 2005 Supreme Court opinion that says, under current law, we can make this Title I. We can take it outside of what the Obama administration did. And we have a 2016 judicial DC Circuit opinion that says we can go the other way too. It's a matter of within agency discretion. And so frankly, no matter where you are on this issue, until we get a new statute, your result is vulnerable because the agency can, under law, do either one. And so that's the rationale about why we think there should be potential for legislation, and there is a common ground for one. There's two problems. One is getting it through this Congress. I think it's going to be quite tough. But the second is the temptation to broaden it to include everyone's pet project will take the legislation down. Because if the simple legislation would do fine, and actually historically up until now, people like Google have said, look, the risks of changing things have been bigger than the risks of status quo. Status quo isn't great, but we can live with it. The real question is, there's a bunch of people who can stop things from happening. Is there enough on the table for all the key actors not to exercise that discretion and to support it coming through? And that still isn't clear to me yet. It happened in 1976 with copyright reform after the Supreme Court changed the copyright for the cable industry. Finally, the broadcast industry got off and supported it for the first time, and it had been brewing for 12 years. The question is there enough skin in the game for each of the actors to get them to line up? And that's possible, but not given at this point in my mind.
Yep.
So one of the things about the network neutrality order for which the chairman of the commission has gotten absolutely excoriated over is a decision he made exempting small ISPs, that is fewer than 250,000 subscribers, from the transparency rules. I'd be fascinated. Kevin, how do you feel about this? Because the Twitterverse burned up over this.
Maybe your Twitterverse did. I don't know. I guess it depends who you're following on Twitter. I guess it's not something that to me is that big a deal. The question was always, what the implementation looks like, and we've got a range of different kinds of providers, and most of the focus is on, a very few, very large broadband providers, but, the reality is there are smaller providers out there. So I don't know. I mean, to me, of the things to fight about and to get upset about, for someone who's a proponent of net neutrality, that never seemed to be the kind of thing that was worth going to the mat over.
There's always been small provider exceptions that kick around. These tend to be rurals. I mean, anyone's only got 250,000 subscribers. We're talking about a very, very small system. And what's interesting to me is this is an example of a temptation in politics for people to yell gotcha. So one of Ajit Pai's personal agendas, while even a minority commissioner in dissent, was greater transparency from the FCC. Now, by that, he meant transparency in FCC decision-making. So one of the odd things, when they voted on something, they wouldn't actually release it to the public, and then, in fact, the staff would then correct the order that the commission voted on to make it conform. Correct in air quotes, because sometimes they would massively rewrite these orders in a substantive sort of way. And anyone who believes in good government says, this should be all clear to the people who are certainly voting on it and to the public and all this so they can actually know how to respond. And then when he and waived the transparency rule, which is what the ISPs are disclosing to end users, they say, oh, Ajit Pai, I thought you were all about transparency. What are you doing? In a way, this is sort of the bargaining point, debating point, scorekeeping form of advocacy, which I've never thought amounted to very much, because it's more about trying to catch someone by saying something that looks bad as opposed to dealing with something on the merits. And so, the plea that, I don't know what the experience you've had in the last 6 months, but the discourse I've had with a lot of my students and in my own self is the need to actually elevate discourse to more serious issues. I mean, Kevin and I disagree on a great deal. There's a real basis for disagreement, and then there's stupid arguments where people are just making problems, and I think that we all need to set better examples by actually taking seriously those obligations if we expect it to improve.
Yeah, and I agree with that, but it's really interesting to watch the politics. Almost every article that I've read about Chairman Pai says former Verizon lawyer Ajit Pai, a net neutrality opponent, and both of those are true statements. But Ajit, I think, worked for Verizon for like a year and a half earlier in his career. He spent much more time at the FCC in the General Counsel's office and on the Hill. He is a strong opponent of net neutrality, but has a lot of other things in his agenda as well, which I think is suggestive of just how significant in the popular perception this issue is. And it's you make no mistake, open internet is tremendously important. But the FCC, it's not the Federal Net Neutrality Commission, right? It's the Federal Communications Commission, and there's a lot more going on than that. And I don't think that Chairman Pai fully anticipated that reaction. I mean, you follow him on Twitter, and he's either joking about Kansas or his kids or something like that, or talking about his transparency initiatives or broadband deployment initiatives, which again are all real, but he's very clearly trying to put out a persona about, look, this is who I am, and it's not working. To the extent that his goal is to get the press or the public to see him that way. And part of that is at some point you just can't fight the meme, and this is all again about sort of the meta discussion about as opposed to the issues themselves. But that's the nature of the environment we're in.
But okay, civility and discourse. Former Verizon lawyer Ajit Pai, let's be clear, is an ad hominem attack. This is not on the merits. It's not actually discussing.
Well, as was cable lobbyist Tom Wheeler.
Absolutely, and for that matter. And the funny thing is, if you're going to do this, do it for your own as well. I mean, we all come from someplace. Gigi Sohn worked for them. Free press president and public knowledge advocate. Free net neutrality advocate working for Tom Wheeler. Well, yeah, we know where she came from. She came from the Ford Foundation, which was funding this on one side, which is fine. And to suggest that experience somehow disqualifies her from participating in the discourse is a very strange concept. I mean, we all come from someplace, usually very complex places and usually multiple places, and they enrich what we do. To me, those sorts of epithets are really designed to avoid dealing with things on the merits. And if we ever needed to really focus on dealing with things on the merits, it's now. And so, I hope, again, as part of this discourse, we have enough real issues to talk about. Those throwaway lines are designed to score points with constituencies who are already on your side instead of actually creating enlightening debates and making them move forward. Now, the other part of and this is the last part of network neutrality, is the FCC privacy order, which they issued in November 2016. The network neutrality rules brought into these old telephone privacy rules, and they updated them in November 2016. And right now, they're currently under a reconsideration by the Federal Communications Commission. There is a expedited Congressional Review Act procedure where Congress can knock down rules. There were hundreds of rules that potentially qualified. There was an understanding within Congress they were going to pick 12 and put them in a resolution to knock them down. The network neutrality privacy rules are one of them as of right now, and that's basically been submitted, and that's the negotiation, although until it's done, you never really know. And it'll be interesting to see what will happen in the aftermath of these rules. It's widely assumed that either through, and this is the game between Congress and the FCC of chicken, neither one would rather be the person holding the knife on this one. But there's an interesting game going on right now about who's going to act, and in fact, if they strike down those rules, what's going to happen. The traditional privacy enforcer has been the Federal Trade Commission. The Federal Trade Commission is subject to a statutory limitation that they cannot regulate common carriers. The network neutrality rule, by reclassifying ISPs as common carriers, took common carriers outside of FTC jurisdiction. So the FCC is exercising in the gap. There was a huge fight. They've actually regulated more restrictively than the FTC does. And in fact, that violates what many people say is the principle of technological neutrality. We should have one set of privacy rules that applies equally to the whole industry. And the FCC took the position that the reason we're regulating ISPs more strictly is because they pose the greater threat from a privacy standpoint. And in fact, there's an interesting discourse right now. The idea, I've done some writing on this and done some research, the claim that in fact the Comcast and the Verizon of the world see more private and personal information about consumers than the Facebooks and the Googles of the world, to me as a factual matter just seems to be wrong. Is that if you look at the advertising dossiers that the edge providers are able to develop, just because they have so much more contact with us across so many more presences, particularly in a smartphone era, where you log on and every time you touch Gmail or search or do these things, they automatically get what you're doing. I actually think that the premise of doing that is wrong. But setting that aside, to me, unified privacy regulation just seems to be a much better way to go.
Yeah, so this is an issue that's not going to go away, whatever happens about the FCC proceeding, because it's about more than the FCC and communications policy. It's about these big issues around privacy in a digital age, which are big issues here in the US, and they're huge issues globally. And part of what's coming down the pike is in 2018, a new set of regulations called the GDPR go into effect in Europe. Already the existing European privacy rules are much stricter than the typical norm for most of the US, and we've been able to barely paper over that through a series of agreements. The GDPR rules go a lot further. And so at some point there's going to be this immovable object is going to be hit by this irresistible force, whichever is which, because it is a global internet and we're not going to have data that somehow stops halfway across the Atlantic in either direction. And so no one, to my sense, in the US has yet really figured that part out. And I don't quite know what the new administration is going to do, but that's coming. Before that, though, we have to get our own ducks in a line. And it's interesting that there are three possible outcomes here to what Christopher sets up. One is what we have now, where there are stronger, basically opt-in data collection rules for broadband access providers, and basically opt-out disclosure and unfair and deceptive rules for everyone else. One outcome is that, which I think is probably more what you would favor, is that the rules for everyone look more like the FTC rules, that they don't require this opt-in. The other possible outcome is that the rules for everyone look more like the FCC rules. And all three of those outcomes have bases of support. And I would certainly agree with Christopher that the status quo where there's inequality, just as a logical matter, doesn't make a great deal of sense. And it's an artifact of historical stuff. And so we get back to the only way really to change that, to get rid of this FTC common carry exemption, is legislation. And that would not have to be necessarily comprehensive legislation, but any legislation on a controversial topic like this, as we said, is going to be hard. This is one where something is going to happen, but even more than net neutrality, I think it's going to still be a front burner issue, however it comes out.
So if you understand the hybrid world we're in now, to me it's best exemplified by Google Fiber. Google Fiber is an ISP. And it's a video provider, and it has all these services in between, like its navigation on its iPad. Somewhere in the unified Google system, it stops being regulated by the FCC and starts being regulated by the FTC. And the rules are subtly different. So we now have to make, in this fairly uncertain world, a company like Google have to figure out which rules apply where, and it's not great.
And a company like Comcast, and a company like Verizon, and a company like AT&T Time Warner soon.
An NBC Comcast merger and AT&T Time Warner merged. I mean, Verizon has acquired Yahoo, has acquired AOL, and more importantly, has acquired a great deal of smart city technologies. Because unified provision is increasingly becoming more and more important. That's actually the world we're moving towards, and it's probably a good world. But these sorts of hybrid situations end up being very hard. The European thing is a bomb waiting to go off in our faces. So what people don't recognize is, even though this, strictly speaking, didn't have anything to do with Snowden, the politics had everything to do with Snowden. And it's funny, you had to be abroad after the Snowden allegations. I don't care anything in this space, whether it was involving the Snowden allegations or not. You were being prepared to be yelled at for the entirety of the conference, basically for the position of the Americans.
You don't think that was just you? No, okay.
Well, I know for a fact it wasn't just me. And in fact, I got the easy part because I wasn't part of the government at the time. The government people just got pounded into oblivion. But what's interesting is what they've said is that the way it works in Europe, they have strict privacy rules, but they have something called the privacy safe harbor, that even if you didn't strictly comply with the European rules, if you applied with a different set of rules called the safe harbor, we will treat you as if you're in compliance with the European rules. And they said, Snowden revealed that the US is not in compliance. And so they took us outside the safe harbor, in which case we have to comply formally with European rules, use one of the other mechanisms, or don't sell services in Europe at all. And what's fascinating, first, yes, right now, because we don't comply. And what's interesting is actually there's a potential WTO case to be brought against the EU, because apparently they take the position, the US position is Israel is just as bad as we are, and you're not kicking them out of the safe harbor. And so in fact, this is retaliatory trade, and there's actually a decent chance they might win that if they choose to bring it. More importantly, they're now trying to negotiate a replacement called the Privacy Shield, which began under the Obama administration. They made some progress. With the stance of the current administration towards globalization and a withdrawal from Europe, I actually think it's going to be materially harder for them to reach a deal on the Privacy Shield. And this is a huge issue for US tech companies, is that they're now going to have to find, there's these other much more strenuous and much more difficult ways to comply with this apparatus, or they're going to have to localize data in Europe, and it's just really going to be quite tough.
Yeah, and not just tech companies, any company that has operations or customers that have any connection to anyone in Europe, which is vast, most U.S. companies of any scale. And the challenge here is on net neutrality. Okay, so we've got a permanent FCC chairman. We've got a second commissioner, Mike O'Reilly, who also is very experienced and very well known. We've got all the key people in Congress. We know where they are. On these privacy issues, we've got two FTC commissioners, an acting chair, Maureen Ohlhausen, who is also a well-known, experienced, thoughtful Republican, and Terrell McSweeney, the legacy Democrat. But of the Trump administration people, Ohlhausen is, unlike Chairman Pai at the FCC, is only the acting chair. And perhaps she will eventually become the permanent chair, but there doesn't seem to be any indication of that. And so at the FTC, it's not clear what the leadership's going to be. And anywhere else, your guess is as good as mine, because at places like the State Department, which plays a critical role here, and other parts of the government, the people that might have these jobs have not been named, and there's not even a great deal of indications about who those people might be. So this one is a real wild card where we still don't even know what the agenda is going to be.
And nature abhors a vacuum. So one of the problems we're going to have, it's very clear that this president was not prepared for I don't think he expected to win. He doesn't have the nominations queued up. So what happens? That opens the door for leading senators, key committees to come in. It leaves the door for Pence and the vice president to come in and actually direct some of these nominations. I will tell you on the FCC side, my worst case scenario is if someone from the religious right chose to pursue an explicitly content-based agenda through an FCC commissioner chairman, which ended up not happening, but to me was a real possibility for a certain amount of time. What we will see in the FCC remains to be seen. The other key organization within the Commerce Department is the National Telecommunications and Information Administration, the NTIA. They don't even have a general counsel. They've got so many layers above the administrators to go. They're in limbo, and they have no idea what to do. And especially in a world where we're going to transition, we're not going to talk about network neutrality the whole time because we've been dominated for the last 12 years. One of the big questions is who's going to run one of the clear commitments of the current administration during the campaign, which is infrastructure investments, which is trying to increase infrastructure. One of the debates happening right now in DC is that infrastructure program going to include an internet build-out program? And I think the answer is pretty clear at this point is yes. And the question then becomes, what is the form of that program going to be? Who's going to run it in terms of the agencies, and how is this all going to play out? So the best example, the baseline we have for this is there was a $7 billion infrastructure program as part of the Obama stimulus plan. It was run basically by three entities. One was the NTIA and the Commerce Department. Another was the RUS and it's the Rural Something Service.
Rural
and the
Utility Service.
Utility Service in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, of all places. And I cannot for the life of me remember the third. There were three programs. The other two
No,
were both run by
those are the two big buckets of money, yeah.
And I think, let's just say, neither NTIA nor RUS bathed themselves in glory in the implementation of this program, because frankly, neither one was set up to be really grant-making authorities. Well, NTIA worse than RUS. And a lot of the RUS grants didn't go, they were agreed to, they're still not deployed. There's a lot of frustration. And what I've heard is that they're actually going to give this, there will be a broadband component to it, is the wide suspicion, and that they're going to give it to the FCC to run under its experience of allocating universal service money. Now, those of us who've been watching this for a long time, embracing the universal service apparatus and experience of the FCC is not a happy thing. I mean, this has been extremely criticized as inefficient and prone to fraud and abuse and all these other problems, and it's not been actually a happy solution. So I don't know that that's a great solution, but it seems pretty clear that we're going to start throwing as part of the money of infrastructure money at broadband. The tougher question for me is it's fairly clear to me there are some broadband investments that we could do that would be very helpful. There's some rural backhaul areas which are extremely challenged. There's tribal lands. There's places who don't have service. The problem we have is when we've actually paid to overbuild existing service, and what ends up happening is a lot of these services fail because what happens? The incumbent cuts price. Now, does that make them evil? They're trying to kill well, it's the natural thing to do when you face competition is you're going to cut price. And a lot of the models that they said are why this is going to succeed are built on the current price level of the incumbent. There's no reason you should expect them not to react. And in general, at the lower levels, it's very, very hard to do. The second problem is the munis. What you'll find is, especially if you're in a competitive environment, you have to do a lot of things like marketing and outreach to try to compete for customers. Guess what? The people who run these companies, and especially if it's a municipal government, they're not good at it. They weren't elected because that's what they wanted to do. And running a telecommunications institution is a full-time job. And in general, the experience has been not that happy. And so it's not entirely, actually, I love the idea of an infrastructure program. I worked in the Congress as a staffer in the late 1980s, where there were reports talking about the design lives of our bridges built post-World War II are wearing out. I think our rail infrastructure could use a huge jolt in the arm. There's a lot of really fundamental investments I think that are worth doing. What I'm worried about is the broadband program. I actually think there's room for them to do positive things in areas which aren't going to be served by private industry. And that's an interesting question. But places which are already being served, we have enough other places that aren't being served. I think we're wasting our money trying to provide better competitive service or additional service in those places.
So I actually worked at NTIA part-time as a special government employee as part of that broadband grant program. So all the bad parts were my fault. But no, actually I wrote the net neutrality rules, but among other things. But we could talk about the historical circumstance, but I think probably better to focus on what's going on now. I'm not quite as convinced as Christopher is that there's going to be a serious, significant broadband component to the infrastructure plan, assuming there actually really is an infrastructure initiative. It's certainly something that the administration wants to do and something that there's a lot of sympathy for in Congress, again, on a fairly bipartisan basis. But it's not entirely clear what that means. So does this mean we're going to borrow money at the historically low cost of capital and issue bonds and fund $1 trillion of infrastructure, or does this mean we're going to basically have tax incentives very widely for construction companies, which are very different things. Once that fundamental thing gets determined, then we can ask the question about what does that mean in the broadband context. As I think I alluded to before, Chairman Pai talks a lot about and emphasizes, and I think generally cares a lot about broadband deployment in rural areas. It is one of his personal priorities, and so presumably it is something that he and his staff have made clear to the White House that they want this to be part of an infrastructure plan. But again, the question is what exactly that looks like. And I would assume, based on his orientation, that his view is going to be similar to what Christopher described. He's not seeing this as a way to get a lot more competitors, but more as a way to build out in areas where there hasn't been a build out. I'm just suspicious that there's going to be a way to do a serious broadband infrastructure investment plan on top of this infrastructure plan when we actually see it. But we'll see. The other piece, I'll stop there. Yeah.
So it's interesting. So let's do some rough numbers. So if you think about, right now, 37 million Americans don't have access to the internet, according to the 25 meg standard in the most recent report.
Don't have access to broadband.
Broadband internet.
Yeah.
Everyone's got dial-up. Everyone's got access to lower grades.
Satellite, yeah.
Satellite. So if we're going to extend that as the benchmark, and it's an interesting question on universal service, whether we need to do 25 meg, because if you're going to apply for jobs, you actually don't need 25 meg. You need web access, which is much lower. Actually, what you need 25 meg for is video. And there's an interesting question of whether we should consider video in the public service mandate of universal service, especially in a world where we're already giving free spectrum to the broadcasters to provide free access to video to people in this world. More importantly, this is where I get caught up. You actually can make a case if you talk about distance learning and these certain aspects where you are video intensive. Although that tends to be pre-recorded video, the thing you really worry about is interactive video where you need those sort of heavy bandwidths, and we'll get into an interesting conversation about whether that's worth that. But okay, let's buy the 25 meg. For 37 million people, call it, I don't know, 10, 15 million households at, let's give it a nice round number, 1,000 per household passed. We're talking about a $15 billion program. And this is at a time where the current budget is being called dead on arrival because of the pressure they're being put on it. The ability to carve this out in terms of direct funding is very low. Now, Kevin makes a very interesting question, which brings up to another point, which is about bond funding, which is we can try to do this not by so much by paying for it, but by financing and supporting the financing of it. I'm actually doing a study of bond funding of publicly funded broadband networks, and I'm running financial analyses on these. I'm not prepared to release the results, but one of the things that always bothered me in this argument, people would say, who cares what your results are? Suppose the venture doesn't cover its costs. This is the kind of thing the government should be investing in anyway. Well, what I will tell you is, I don't know who's issuing this bonds. They're usually municipalities. It might be some higher level, but let's say it's a municipality. Here's the reality. If you can't cover your bond costs, you're going to have to default on your bonds. And if you default on your bonds, your cost of capital is going to go up on every future bond you issue. In other words, your ability to do road projects, school projects, everything else is going down the crapper. And so if there's no, the idea that we can excuse this is something you should be spending on, if that's the case, do it out of general revenues. But if you do it on a bond funding, you've got to have some reasonable expectation it's going to pay out. And if the excuse is you shouldn't have to pay it out, then you shouldn't be doing bond funding to begin with. Because I've actually seen in the research I've done, I'll give you one nightmare scenario. A city borrowed $7 million to build a broadband system. Their annual budget is $3 million. They were running losses of $300,000 a month. So that's $3.6 million a year. In other words, better than their budget. They got it down to $60,000 a month. And they eventually unloaded the system for $1 million, leaving them in the pocket for $6 million in debt. That is twice the annual budget of the whole city. And so the ability to recover from that, it's going to take them a generation to pay off that debt, or they're going to default on it. And if they default on it, then they're going to face an environment in which their ability to do anything else in this. And this is basically taken down 2 consecutive administrations of municipal government. There's just no way to get around it because they're dealing with this 24/7, 365. They didn't get elected to deal with this kind of problem. They wanted to do good in the world, and basically they're swallowed up trying to deal with this system. So my reaction is you actually have to pay attention to the financials when you're talking about bond funding. And if you're serious about saying this is a publicly funded initiative, then you should fund it with public money instead of doing bond revenue that you're going to have to bail out later with public money, and you're going to do a bait and switch on the voters, because that's just not fair.
Although I will note that we have a president who has 4 times filed for bankruptcy,
Yeah.
wiping out his lenders. So perhaps that's not such a scary proposition for this White House.
Well, he talked about defaulting on the federal debt, and
Yes,
I mean,
no,
it's
this
just
is, this is true. So something else, not directly responsive to that's worth talking about in this infrastructure context for broadband is 5G. Because if we really want to think about where's the world going and what is the development that could dramatically change both the service profile as well as the competitive landscape, it's the prospect of having very high capacity mobile and wireless broadband connectivity using 5G. And the issue with 5G is you need lots and lots of small cells. So there's an issue about just the physical siting and location and all that of all these towers and smaller antennas. And you need lots of backhaul. So if you're going to provide a gigabit, or even, it may not be a gigabit, but several hundred megabits of mobile broadband service out to one handset, you need many gigabits of backhaul off of the back of all those small cells or the aggregation points. 5G is important not just for broadband to humans, it's critically important for Internet of Things, which again is this massive wave that is coming across all these different industries. I think if we, sort of to Christopher's point about, what's the 25 megabit per second, is that really, what's important or what people need? I think, if we look a few years out, what's the debate going to be about if we're talking about broadband infrastructure in the United States? It's not so much going to be just about how do we get everyone on fiber or fiber-like connectivity. And I will just, as one aside, note that, you're back of the envelope, $15 billion to get high-speed broadband to everyone. When the National Broadband Plan came out in 2010, their estimate at that point was $300 billion. To
100 million homes.
200 million homes, right, to get, which is basically almost everyone, not even quite to everyone. If we're down from 300 to 30 or 15 to fill in the rest of the problem, that's actually not such a bad thing. But I do agree, no one in Washington has 15 or 30 billion dollars lying around that they're just willing to give out. But I actually suspect that whatever happens with this infrastructure bill, and while I'm skeptical that we're going to see anything really of the scale that's being talked about once all the details come out, there will be an infrastructure bill or something they call an infrastructure bill or an infrastructure plan because it's just become so talked about. Whatever that includes, I think when we look a few years down the road at what the real issues are in implementation, it's going to be all these 5G questions, which in some ways are actually somewhat different sets of issues, and I don't know that there's enough thought in Washington going into what that looks like.
15 bill and 10 bill is unrealistic. That's the numbers for the existing builds. That's the most dense areas we've got. It's going to be higher. I mean, I'm just throwing numbers out. 5G. Let's talk about this. So this is one of the hot issues going on right now. So before we get into what is 5G? Because the fundamental thing is it's a new generation, and in the beginning, 5G was a marketing ploy by Europe because they were leaders in 3G. They missed the 4G bandwagon. So part of them is politically they want to get to 5G as quickly as possible because 4G, the long we stayed there, was just embarrassing to them. And in fact, the major deployment we're seeing now is a next generation 4G technology called LTE Advanced, which can actually do a lot more speeds. So the thing that the technologists will all say, there has to be something fundamentally different about the architecture for it to be 5G. Now this is happening. So they're talking about small cells, they're talking about equal migration where you seamlessly move from cell to cell, which tends not to happen right now. But politically, the most important thing is it's using a part of the spectrum called the millimeter wave band, which we've never used before. We never thought we could use before. Why is that important? From a politics standpoint, any other part of the spectrum, you have to move someone out of there to get a new use in there. And those guys don't go quietly into the night. They go kicking and screaming and their hands out and they demand money. Because the millimeter wave band is current, and you can see this, even people who didn't need it. Right now we're fighting over allocating 5G spectrum, more of it to Wi-Fi, one of the most successful technologies. Turns out the auto industry is sitting there. They're supposed to use it for connected cars. They're saying, but you're not actually using it now, but they say we're going to, and two politically powerful industries slugging it out and work this out to a scoreless tie right now, and it'll probably just stay put. The beauty of 5G is you can actually slot them in where they need to be and not have to displace any of the other people that are there. This is also what we'll talk briefly about, what we call the incentive auctions. There's another plan we have to move people by green mailing them out of it. You pay them you auction off the proceeds for the spectrum and then take that money and use it to pay the people to move. It's an interesting double auction, which you have to try to work out. And it'll be interesting to see if that emerges as a model. But 5G is sort of an epical opportunity to try to open up a new competitive environment in ways that don't require us to do the gyrations we've had to do in the past.
Yeah, so I'll say what you said to me about net neutrality. It's a little more complicated than that. Christopher is absolutely right. 5G is kind of a slogan that gets put on a lot of different things for different reasons. One chunk of it is millimeter waves, is very high spectrum, but there's a lot of use of newer technologies, not necessarily in the same spectrum that we're using now, in ways that can dramatically increase the capacity. And some of the applications I'm talking about, like Internet of Things, are different kinds of applications that might not necessarily require very high throughput, but they require serving lots and lots of devices in a distributed way and so forth. The millimeter wave piece, though, is a big piece of it, and it's not all empty. So there are actually a number of companies. So the FCC has defined the frontier of spectrum allocation historically up to 95 gigahertz, which is way far up there. And it hasn't gone beyond that, but now there are systems on the drawing board that would actually use even above 95 gigahertz. So that's one thing that will certainly be on the agenda for the new FCC. But all the spectrum above the sort of current existing services up from there to 95 is not empty. And there are a number of companies that have acquired licenses and rights in that spectrum, anticipating that it would be valuable when 5G came along, including companies. There's a company called Straight Line that I believe is funded by some private equity people, which said, aha, if we can go and just grab a bunch of these frequencies, then we can sell out to someone when it becomes useful. The FCC actually did an enforcement action against them a few months ago, requiring them to give up a lot of those frequencies because they actually had no intent of using them, and they were actually violating the rules. They still have a spectrum portfolio in some of the millimeter wave bands. So it's actually relatively messy. The way the FCC originally set up the millimeter wave band, there was this mechanism where it wasn't a traditional spectrum allocation. You could sort of claim a license if you were going to use it. So there's work to be done, and it's not just this kind of wide open space. I think in the next 5 years, we'll get a lot more clarity. Right now, it's true. There's a lot of companies labeling things 5G. There's a lot of countries labeling things as 5G, and who's going to do the first 5G trials. And as with any kind of evolution, it's not going to be a stark thing where suddenly we're going to this is 4G and 5G is radically different and not overlapping. But there are a lot of new applications and new needs at scale. That especially a lot of these things which get lumped under Internet of Things, which are going to require different architectures and different levels of capacity than what we have now. So this is going to it's going to be a big issue. It's one of those that there are certainly different views within different players, but unlike the net neutrality thing, it's not one that has an absolutely clear partisan breakdown.
Now, what's interesting that ties into 5G is one of the initiatives of the new commission is something called the BDAC, the Broadband Deployment Advisory Committee. And this is the spectrum part of it's one sexy part of it, and it's clearly a federal part. What's fairly clear is there's a lot of local regulation that is obstructing broadband deployment. Different forms of zoning, different forms of licensing of towers, access to poles, all these different things. And actually explicit licensing requirement. You have to get a certificate of public necessity and convenience, public interest, necessity, and convenience often from municipalities, and they often use these processes either just to block entry and to actually extract rents. In fact, one of the interesting initiatives that the chairman is launched is to create a committee to study this and to create a model code to guide cities to try to push for reform to make this easier. And in fact, you see companies like Verizon who've negotiated with Boston to actually try to deploy this different architecture that involves 5G of these small cells, which require you to put things in different places. In the interest of full disclosure, I actually put my name in to be a potential member of the BDAC. I have no idea what's going to happen with that, but it's quite possible I may get involved in this process. But it struck me as a perfect place for an academic to get involved. Sharda Srinivasan, who is in the front row, actually did some studies of this in India, and discovering the extent to which local licensing is happening in India just to obstruct the deployment of broadband is breathtaking. Because there's just all this municipal, state, federal regulation, all of which have to be, you have to induce their agreement, which means generally you have to pay them something. And then there's 7 levels, even within the Ministry of Communication, there are 7 levels of approval. Now, getting 7 people to say yes to anything is hard enough. When they've all got their hand out, it just becomes a cost of doing business. And so, I mean, what you see is a world where it's very, very difficult to do this. We saw this with cable licensing. We talked about doing national franchises. Then the state of Texas and the state of New York, some large states, did statewide licenses instead of doing city by city, and solved a lot of the problems. But it's a different version of the same thing. I'm looking at Caroline Olson, who used to work for the city. By the way, cities hate the solutions to this because it means taking them out, and it means they don't get revenue anymore. And how they replace that is a real public finance issue that we're going to have to deal with. But finding a happy medium of getting rid of the frictional obstructions to broadband deployment, I actually think is a topic worthy of any administration, Democratic or Republican.
Yeah, and it's not just the money. Like they get pissed off people saying, "Look at this ugly tower that was put up and blocked my view," and all of that as well. No, absolutely. So I remember when I was on the Obama transition in 2008, we had lots of discussions with industry and with others about the serious problems about tower siting, about local access to rights of way and poles and conduits, and how important that was to broadband deployment. The Obama administration had something called, I think it's the Broadband Opportunity Council, where they got together all the different federal agencies, not the FCC, but all the other agencies that potentially had some involvement or potential involvement in removing barriers. They had a number of programs, and Chairman Pai has this initiative, which I agree is a great thing. It's that this is one that it's hard to disagree with. Except for the politics and the reasons why nothing has changed that much up till now. And this will be kind of an interesting test case. Would this administration want to take a more aggressively national approach to say, basically, we are, because this is important as a matter of national purpose, we are going to override municipalities and states on this. Which cuts against a lot of the kind of devolutionary federalist strain of at least certain parts of the Republican coalition. So, we'll see on that, but there's no question, there's a lot of good work that can be done.
So interestingly, my college roommate actually is an attorney for the law firm in Chicago that is AT&T's primary attorney. And he always he has to do these zoning hearings all over the place for cell tower sightings. And whenever he gets those objections, he gets a weather balloon and puts it at the site of the cell tower at the height it's supposed to be. It's eventually going to be a built out level. And then he goes to right in front of the house of the person complaining and takes a picture and submits it to the city council. And it's amazing how effective this is at diffusing arguments. They're saying, come on, Dave, it's only like, I mean, you can't. And people just don't want stuff around them, but when you get down to it, I mean, this causes huge problems, which is if we want the services, we have to have a certain amount of tolerance for this, and it's a remarkably effective way to make it very clear to everyone what the real trade-off is. Parenthetically, one of my favorite stories is Belgium actually had limits on electric power emissions from cell towers that the healthcare information said it should be X, and they actually intentionally made it 3X lower, a third of what was supposed to be permissible. And then when LTE came along, there's actually still no LTE in Brussels because you cannot actually make LTE work at those emission levels. And so you can do those sorts of moves, there's just consequences. Actually, they've got a huge problem is that if the data didn't matter in the initial decision, what data do you show them to get them to change their mind? Actually, probably angry consumers who want LTE is about all you got. But it's a quite interesting phenomenon when you watch these decisions getting made. So before we open up for questions, I want to throw out one last question, which I think is going to be quite different on this administration than the prior one. National security in this space. I mean, this is obviously an administration that has signaled that in the choice between national security and individual privacy or individual liberty, he's going to put the thumb on the scale of national security pretty heavily. He's excoriated Apple for resisting not turning over everything. He's excoriated any one of a number of tech companies. And plus, he's engaging in a war on Amazon because they own the Washington Post and he hates the Washington Post. And so, it's quite striking. I see a lot of my colleagues from Annenberg here. I mean, one of the things I want to say is, I hope all of us at this point will go hug your favorite media person because they're on the front lines right now and doing the things we hope a media industry will do. And they're taking a beating. And they're doing what we need them to do in a democracy. And I think, as I watch them, the courts strike down some of the immigration orders, I tell everyone who's badmouthed lawyers in the last decade, I think owes at least one of us an apology. I think all of us owe the media industry right now a huge hug because they are asking tough questions. They're pushing on limits in ways that I think with a courage that a lot of us thought we would have after the election, and not a lot of us have come up and stepped up to the plate. And so I think that they deserve our immense praise. What do you see happening in national security, Kevin?
Well, if I told you, I'd have to kill you.
Yeah.
But I agree with your assessment. The FCC has an underappreciated role in national security with the communications industry. But I see it that's a subsidiary to this larger set of issues. That's clearly the direction this administration wants to go. But when you start pushing more against civil liberties and pushing more into big government black helicopter types spying on Americans, you're going to get a pushback not just from the left. You're going to get a lot of pushback from the right. So at the moment, I think a lot of this feels kind of theoretical to people. To sort of most ordinary people. I suspect that if there is a real kind of visible push, given what we saw after the Snowden revelations and so forth, that there's going to be a lot of pushback and not just popular pushback and not just pushback from the Democrats. But the media point you made is important as well, and it goes back to something that you said earlier on, which I completely agree with, which is the greatest danger of a Trump FCC is not that the chairman is someone like Ajit Pai, even though I disagree with a lot of his initiatives. It's within the normal consensus. The greatest danger is you get someone at the FCC who sees their job to basically beat up on the media and beat up on communications companies. And we saw a lot of this, for example, in the Nixon administration, where he was trying to use the FCC to withhold licenses from the Washington Post and so forth. And given the proclivities of this president and the people around him, it would be surprising to me if there are not efforts from the White House to push the FCC to, for example, hold AT&T's feet to the fire on the Time Warner merger, to do other things against companies that seem to be unfriendly with their media assets, using the levers that the FCC has to pull. Now, the FCC is an independent agency. That's not the way it's supposed to work. And again, I don't think that the current two majority commissioners or any of the three commissioners at the FCC have any desire to go down that road. But this White House is kind of tough to resist at times. And so that, I think, is still something that is a concern in this area. I agree, not the level of concern as if we had someone else be the chairman. But I think that's still going to be an issue. It's just inconceivable. There's not going to be other efforts to squash the media using the various levels of power in the government.
I mean, historically, there's been a long legacy of this. When we had 1952, the initial television allocations, there was a rule against a newspaper owning a television station. Waivers were granted for certain newspapers. Coincidentally, the only newspapers that received them were ones that endorsed the Eisenhower candidacy during the presidency. And that's been documented by Bernard Schwartz and other people. The other famous war is there was a bar against foreign ownership of television stations. Rupert Murdoch had a very conservative newspaper, Boston Herald, and a television station to go with it. He got waivers. Teddy Kennedy pressured the FCC into denying the waiver, and because he's a foreign ownership, try to force him out of that. Rupert Murdoch solved the problem by becoming an American citizen. That's a different problem, but it makes clear it's a different solution, but it makes clear that there are parts of this process that are politically vulnerable. I mean, vulnerable to political squeeze, and that have historically been used in that way. And so it's something we have to be very careful about, and it's something that I think that we should all take very seriously. We do have a reception, so I don't mean to get anyone, but we'd be remiss if we didn't open the floor if there's any questions that anyone would like to ask. Please.
Do you see anything happening with nationwide public safety? That was something that the government tried to have happen with LTE or a separate watchdog. Is that a bad idea?
So, I mean, Kevin, you'll have to help me if I get this wrong. I actually think that they then issued that block dedicated to public safety.
FirstNet,
And it becomes FirstNet now. And so, in fact, one of the interesting problems they have is not so much that, but it's subsidies for equipment. The reason, I mean, you hear these nightmare stories where people have non-interoperable systems, partly because of service rivalries and not wanting to do that. But more importantly, they wanted to rely on the old generation equipment. They need grants. I mean, these cities are broke. I mean, they don't have a lot. I mean, you see that, in some way, Bush v. Gore is due to the fact that we have antiquated voting equipment and no one's going to get elected by dropping a few mil on modern voting machines. Actually, I think that they did create a grant program for the voting machines, but I also think they have some funding now to modernize the equipment. But that's one of those little-known things where we actually do need much better help. You hear these nightmare stories where people are just using cell phones and calling each other directly because they know how to do it, which is not horrible, but that we can do better than that.
Yeah, I mean, it's a tragedy that we're here 16 years after 9/11 and we still don't have operational, a national interoperable public safety network, and that's bipartisan, across a long period of time. There is this initiative, this program FirstNet. It is funded with some money that came out of some of the spectrum auctions. I haven't looked too closely at it lately, but the last time I did, there was a lot of skepticism about whether it was going to be viable for the reasons Christopher described in terms of some of the technology choices they made, some of the economic assumptions underlying the model. Because the idea is that this is basically spectrum that's override spectrum that then could be provided to the private sector on an underlay basis. So there is something happening. It's not that this would have to be a new initiative, but yeah, it could, for example, collapse in the next few years in some way. But it's again not something that the public safety community is very concerned about it, as they have been all along. But it's not, I don't think, high up on anyone else's priorities.
Did a good job, guys.
All right, thank you very much.
All right.
But please join me in thanking Kevin and all this. I'm sorry, one more question?
Yeah, so what about white space broadband for rural broadband deployment? That's something that was talked about.
Yep.
Didn't seem to get off the ground from a equipment perspective.
It's the king of white spaces.
Well, no, it's also something where it was set up in the way the FCC established the service rules for white space. They took a very conservative approach in terms of power limits and so forth, which made it difficult to do white spaces, for example, in any urban area, which is partly a choice. This was something that would be particularly valuable for rural areas that don't have service, but then those are places where there's not a lot of people who have the resources to go in and build these systems. They're not necessarily going to be the numbers of devices to get the unit prices down and so forth. There are multiple operators of the white spaces database, which is the underlying technical system, and it's there. I mean, the thing with spectrum is big innovations sometimes take a really long time. So you look at Wi-Fi. And the 2.4 gigahertz unlicensed band, which is this unbelievable, extraordinary success story. That was well over a decade between the time the FCC allocated that as unlicensed and the time Wi-Fi actually took off. And I think it was closer to 15, 20 years, actually. It was in the early 80s that happened. I think the book hasn't entirely been written on white space. And there's some interesting work that's starting to be done looking at this kind of model, the white spaces model, which is basically a database to see who's using the spectrum how and managing in that way on a kind of distributed basis. Something similar the FCC is doing in 3.5 gigahertz with what's called a spectrum access system. And there's some academics starting to look at using blockchain technology or distributed ledger technology as a next generation distributed database architecture. for these kind of spectrum solutions, as well as some industry players are thinking about this as well. Not something that's going to go into production in the next couple of years, but I think if we're looking back 20 years from now, that will be something that happened in this time frame that everyone will say, oh yes, it's obvious it was a big success.
So for those of you who don't know what white spaces are, television stations broadcast in a certain area, and then the signal gets weaker and weaker and weaker, and then they have separation between them, and they have guard bands in between them, because you don't want, there's no signal stays entirely in its frequency, so frequencies above it and below it you also keep open. The question is, if you have two towers here, could a low power operator using a small device operate here without interfering with anybody? The answer is probably yes. And so one of the interesting questions, so they allow them to operate on what we call secondary use bases, which is they have to make sure they don't interfere with the primary uses. So the most interesting part of the white spaces debate to me is involving the incentive auction. After we get all these television stations to give up their spectrum, one of the things we're going to do is repack them, because you want, it'll be this station and this station and this station. It'll be like a comb. You actually want to compress them so you have contiguous spectrum. And they're going to repack them in the most efficient way. Well, the white spaces people are saying, hey, wait a minute. If you repack them too efficiently, there's no more white spaces left. And a lot of people say, what do you think secondary use means? I mean, this is an opportunistic use in service of a primary use. And one of the interesting questions is, do we intentionally use the primary spectrum inefficiently in order to promote white space technology? What strikes me is that we actually have Wi-Fi spectrum, we have unlicensed spectrum, which is really designed to do that. I'd much rather do this as efficiently it's a much more straightforward exercise to do this efficiently and then find unlicensed spectrum as appropriate for things in other places. The problem is the legacy equipment guys, is that you're going to have them to do this. But in a world where the turnover cycle is pretty high and the efficiency of the devices goes up with any generation, we don't want, for example, air pollution purposes, to have late model cars driving around. We actually wouldn't be bad for us to upgrade the equipment.
And if anyone, students out here, want to know what a television station is, we can talk about that at the reception.
Thank you for coming. Please join us in the reception afterwards.